Venezuela's opposition keeps up its pressure on the embattled president, calling for further protests. So how long can Nicolas Maduro cling to power, and can the opposition solve the biggest economic crisis in decades? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the program. I'm Hazem Seeker. Venezuela's government has responded with anger to a U.S. threat to impose economic sanctions on senior officials. It's called the threat brutal and imperial. The measures are aimed at forcing President Nicolas Maduro to abandon a controversial plan to rewrite the constitution. Maduro wants to hold a vote on July 30th for a new assembly. More than 7 million people voted against the proposed changes in an unofficial referendum on Sunday. There are fears it could enshrine one-party rule. Over the past 3 months, there's been almost daily demonstrations with anti- and pro-government protesters taking to the streets. This has plunged the country into an economic turmoil and political uncertainty. We'll get to our discussion in a moment, but first, John Holman reports from Cucuta, close to Colombia's border with Venezuela.
Scenes of street fights between police and anti-government demonstrators have become wearily familiar over the more than 3 months of protests in Venezuela. But the opposition parties now say what they call 0 hour has arrived. In less than 2 weeks, President Maduro will begin the process of rewriting the constitution. He says it's the only way to deal with a divided and economically failing country. The opposition insists it's really to wipe out the last checks on his power. The international community share that concern. US President Donald Trump has promised swift and strong but unspecified sanctions if Maduro goes ahead. The reaction was instant and heated.
The proposal of the original constituent power and for the National Constituent Assembly is already in the hands of the people and solely belongs to the sovereign people of Venezuela, who will exercise their right to vote on July 30 and to no one else.
But the Venezuelan people are anything but united. More than 7 million came out to vote against changing the constitution in an unofficial referendum this Sunday. That's emboldened the opposition-dominated National Assembly to appoint new Supreme Court judges. The current judges are loyal to the government and have frequently blocked opposition legislation.
On
Friday, the Assembly will appoint new judges. It's a flawless process, a process that should get international recognition, a process that allows us to bring the change in public powers that we have been waiting for.
The opposition has also called a national strike this Thursday, but there's a limit to the pressure it can exert domestically while the government still has the support of police and the military. The opposition knows that it needs all the help from the international community that it can get, and President Trump's administration has said that in terms of sanctions, nothing is off the table. The toughest measure it could impose is a ban on Venezuelan oil. The country is the United States' third largest supplier. But if it does that, then petrol prices for Americans will go up. So the question for the United States and for the rest of the world is how far are they willing to go to intervene? John Holman, Al Jazeera, Cucuta, Colombia.
Now, after Sunday's result, the opposition says it plans to step up its resistance to the government. It's planning what it calls a 0 hour plan. This includes an agreement to form an alternate government and create 2,000 local support committees. That will be followed by a 24-hour nationwide strike on Thursday, which threatens to bring the entire country to a standstill. On Friday, it will nominate 13 judges to the Supreme Court to replace those named by the ruling party. The opposition leader, Freddy Guevara, says final steps will be taken next week, but hasn't explained what they will be. So let's bring in our guests now to talk more about this. In Caracas, we have Phil Gunson, a senior analyst with the International Crisis Group. In Miami, Antonio Mora, a political analyst and lawyer who specializes in Venezuelan politics. And in New York, Diego Aria, a former Venezuelan ambassador to the United Nations who now lives in exile in the U.S. welcome all of you. Phil Gunson in Caracas, let me start with you then. This proposal for a national unity government that the opposition is talking about, does this open the possibility then of this kind of parallel state structure to challenge the government-controlled institutions? And is that going to be a good thing for Venezuela going forward, really?
Yes, it's not just a government of national unity, but the opposition is planning to name a new Supreme Court, neutral authority. So basically, yes, we can have two completely parallel structures and potentially complete chaos. It's not clear in practice how this is going to work. And in fact, the government of national unity itself is a very fuzzy concept that the opposition has not really defined in any great detail. So I guess we'll find out in the next few days.
Antonio Mora, what's your take on this? Do you fear that Venezuela has reached a real tipping point here?
I think Phil and Diego would probably agree with me. I think many analysts have thought there have been multiple tipping points. This general strike tomorrow may certainly become that, although I'm not sure how different that will be than this total paralysis that has existed in Venezuela now for 3.5 months with these huge protests. The question of this parallel government that's going to be named by the opposition with the mandate that they received on Sunday from millions of people who voted. I don't know how this is going to play out. I agree with Phil. It's difficult to know what's going to happen when you have two governments facing each other. The wild card in all of this all along, unfortunately, has been the military, which has so far stuck to the Maduro government, despite the fact that the millions who voted on Sunday called for the military to respect the current constitution and to take the side of the people and the law.
Diego Aria, what's your view on this? And is, as Antonio Mora was saying there, does it all come down to what the military does here? And if at some point they decide that matters have gone too far for the Maduro government, what's likely to happen?
Well, I have to agree with both with Philip and Antonio, but we should be reminded that Sunday, Venezuela gave a civic demonstration never before seen in the Americas. Almost 8 million people organized peacefully, voted in a sort of a plebiscite, which is a popular referendum, to reject the powers of what Maduro is attempting to do, which is a false call to a constituency without calling for direct votes, and also asking for the armed forces to really play this role to preserve the Constitution. I agree with both of them. What the road ahead is very difficult. It's full of uncertainties. And at the same time, I don't believe that two governments will be able to exist at the same time. One will have to give the place to another. The way it seems now, it's difficult to prognosticate which of the two will come ahead.
Well, now the unrest over the Constitution extends much further right into the economy, which we're going to talk a little bit more about now. This is Venezuela's worst financial crisis in recent times. The inflation rate has now spiraled to over 400%. The economy became unsustainable when oil prices fell. That's led to an extreme shortage of basic goods, including medicine and even toilet paper. And the average cost of basic foods is now about 5 times the minimum wage. So, Antonio Mora, we can talk a lot about the politics of all of this, as we will, of course. But for millions of Venezuelans, it comes down to the basics, doesn't it? The price of food, the shortage of so many basic goods. And that is the context in which these protests have been going on now for months. I mean, how much of an effect, just what is life like for Venezuelans on a daily basis there?
It's horrific for the enormous majority of the people in Venezuela. Some studies have shown that more than 80% of Venezuelans now live under the poverty line. That's astonishing because, Hassan, to put this in context, Venezuela not only was the richest country in Latin America, at one point half a century ago, it was one of the richest countries in the world. It had a better economy than many European countries. So this is astonishing how this country has managed to be taken from relative prosperity, although although it was certainly having problems before Chavez took power in the 90s, to this disaster now where you have people foraging for food in garbage. You've got Caritas, the Catholic organization, saying that 11.5% of children in Venezuela are suffering from serious malnutrition. This is really a tremendous crisis, and the government, in its arrogance, refuses to even accept humanitarian help from the rest of the world because it refuses to accept that there's a crisis. It's an absolutely insane situation.
Diego Ario, I mean, how did things get to this point? I mean, when you look at a country like Venezuela that is seemingly so rich in natural resources, oil, gas, minerals, and yet it's in such dire economic shape. How do you explain that?
You know, before coming to that point, I would like to add to something that Antonio mentioned, which I agree completely. The Economist publication last month published an article saying that the Venezuelan lost, as an average, 8 kilograms of weight, each of the Venezuelans, is something unprecedented anywhere in the world. In Venezuela, it's a mixture of incompetence, but fundamentally a massive corruption by the regime, giveaways to many countries, among them, for example, Cuba. We have been giving them 100,000 barrels of oil a day almost for free, and that all to buy complicities, especially in the Caribbean and other countries in Latin America, to complicit to the regime of Venezuela. So it's a mixture of incompetence, but fundamentally of massive corruption of the regime, that there are estimates that at least $300 billion have left the country and are in the hands of most of the people who have been in charge of the government of Venezuela.
Antonio Mora, I know you talked a little bit earlier about this. How much is this perception of government mismanagement and corruption to blame for all of this?
It's a huge problem, and it's certainly not a problem that is new to this regime. It's just that this regime has taken it to a completely other level. As Diego said, that $300 billion number comes from a former Chavez minister, finance minister. So this is a Chavista admitting that they have stolen enormous amounts of money. And so the corruption is certainly a very big part of what's going on, but it's also this tremendous economic mismanagement. PDVSA, the Venezuelan petroleum organization, now produces only about 60% of the oil that it produced when Chavez came into power. Why? Because Chavez at one point decided to fire virtually everyone who had any kind of experience in the petroleum industry in the early 2000s. So that and then the money that the oil company was earning was then being funneled into all sorts of different projects, and not enough was being reinvested. So the whole infrastructure is crumbling. There are estimates that it will drop another 20% by the end of the year. So you've got a perfect storm there of oil prices dropping, plus an oil industry that's not producing the way it should. So it's just a total economic catastrophe.
Phil Gunson, is there a real danger that Venezuela is on a path towards authoritarian rule if the Maduro government continues this way?
No, we're already in authoritarian rule. I think the danger here is of outright military dictatorship, with massive human rights violations and possibly considerably more violence even than we've seen so far. If the armed forces were to fracture, we might even be in a situation of civil war. This is something that really needs to be averted immediately, and the international community, as it now seems to be doing, finally, rather belatedly, needs to pay very close attention to this and help to provide a fix.
Well, let's talk a little more about the international community then. Diego Aria, the OAS, Organization of American States, what sort of a mediating role can they play in all of this? Given as well that the head of that organization, Luis Almagro, has called Maduro a dictator. I mean, is that really the best way of going about for a solution to this?
You know, for many years, we suffered indifference of the whole continent. Most of the countries in the Americas really looked the other way. And it had to do a lot with the Venezuelan wealth, when Venezuela was actually having oil prices around above $100 per barrel. The emergence of the new OAS with Luis Manuel Almagro as the Secretary General has been a fundamental change in the perception of Latin America. When he presented the report last year about the dire situation of Venezuela politically, economically, it actually was a hit. It was an alarm that was hit all over the world. I think thanks to Almagro, Venezuela has become now a center of attention. So most of the countries in the region, and finally gaining much more support from the region as previously experimented before.
Antonio Mora, what's your view of how the international community should handle this, particularly the United States, which with the government there talking about slapping sanctions on Venezuela? Is that going to be helpful?
Well, something needs to be done, Hassan, because if not, you've got this incredible suffering, and we are watching these terrific, terrible human rights abuses on a regular basis. The danger with sanctions, or even going further, and sanctions on individuals, which is mostly what has existed so far, taking it further and imposing sanctions on oil exports and things like that, is that you are cornering the dog in this case. You may have a cornered dog, and the question is, what is that cornered dog going to do if it has no exit? And that is my concern. I do think that the international community needs to take a stronger stance. At this point, there's no other alternative. So I don't want to be interpreted as saying that the international community shouldn't do something stronger. But something they need to think about is what is going to happen to the people who are in power there, many of whom have been indicted by the United States, have been named drug kingpins by the United States. Now 100 political figures from Colombia and Chile have filed a lawsuit with the International Criminal Court in The Hague against Maduro for his human rights abuses. So these people who are in government, if they lose power, could face jail in Venezuela or jail abroad. So I don't know again, it's very difficult to see how this is going to play out.
Yeah, Phil Gunson, given what Antonio Mora has just been saying there, what sort of likelihood is there that Maduro is going to back down from all this?
Well, he's shown no signs of backing down so far, no signs of wanting to engage in serious negotiations. I think it's correct that the international community has a major role to play. And obviously, they're not going to fix it from outside. There has to be continued pressure from inside, from the opposition on the streets and in other ways. I think it's very important that Venezuela's allies, such as Cuba, such as Russia, such as China, realize that this is going nowhere, and that they at least don't stand in the way of the kind of thing that Antonio was talking about, an exit for the ruling clique, who really have no future here in Venezuela and will need some kind of protection elsewhere if they're to be convinced that they should leave the country.
Diego Aria, obviously we've talked a lot about how terrible the economic situation is there for many Venezuelans, but the government will say that they were democratically elected, that they are not authoritarian, they have the support of millions of people, and that there will be elections again. What's wrong then with letting that process play out and just waiting until the next election?
Well, it is true that they were more or less democratically elected, that there are many doubts about it, but today 85% of the population rejects them. And there is something in our constitution which exists in many other constitutions called civil disobedience. This is what happened Sunday, and where you saw almost 8 million people actually complaining and protesting because of violation to our constitution. The Attorney General of the country have declared that Venezuela has broken the democratic institutionality, which means a right for the people to go on civil disobedience. As I said at the beginning, the Americans have never seen such a civic, peaceful reaction of a country like we had last Sunday. It's actually an example of how a society can respond peacefully against a non-authoritarian, against a tyrannic government. There is a difference between the previous dictatorships, for example, in Chile, in Pinochet, and Argentina. The armed forces in those countries were not linked to narco-traffickers. today, most of the hierarchy of the military in Venezuela are linked to cartels in Mexico, Colombia, and drugs, which makes their exit much more difficult. That's precisely the point that both Philip and Antonio were following.
Antonio Mora, how much is, I mean, Nicolas Maduro, of course, succeeded the late Hugo Chavez, who was a very charismatic leader for millions of Venezuelans. So I'm wondering how much, perhaps, is he to blame for what we're seeing now? I mean, is it all down to Nicolas Maduro and the perception that he has completely messed things up?
Well, it certainly has a lot to do with Maduro because certainly he was given, you know, he was dealt a very bad hand of cards when Chavez had destroyed the economy and Maduro had to take it over, and Maduro has just destroyed it further with price controls, with business confiscations, with every imaginable economic action that economists would tell you are a disaster for a country. That's what they've done. And Maduro made it worse last year because then when the Venezuelan opposition, following the Constitution, tried to have a referendum to recall Maduro, the government basically refused, despite the fact that the opposition fulfilled all the requirements many times over. And the government played into these negotiations that were sponsored by the Vatican, where it had, they negotiated in bad faith, let these negotiations drag on, and then at the end basically ignored everything that had been discussed and refused to have this referendum. So Maduro has certainly taken this to a boiling point that would not have been there if they had followed their own constitution.
Phil Gunson, what does the opposition offer in terms of an alternative, particularly on the economic policies? Have we heard much from them about what they would do if they were in power?
Well, you know, the issue at the moment really isn't one of two competing political forces offering the electorate different economic scenarios or political scenarios. What this is about the restoration of democracy. And I think that what first has to happen is not a simple up-down election in which one side wins, one side loses. But there has to be a transition to take Venezuela back to democracy, because this is an emergency situation. This is not a situation in which, as I say, normal politics applies. The opposition clearly would run an economy which would be much more friendly to private enterprise. But basically speaking, it would be much more democratic. And the idea is not at the moment to say to people, how do you want your future government to be run in terms of economic policy and so on, but do you want democracy restored? And that's the option that the opposition is offering, not just the opposition coalition, but the opposition in a much broader sense, because much of that is coming from within people who still think of Hugo Chavez as a hero.
Diego Aria, just in the minute that we got left, how do you see this playing out then? Do you fear that things will continue to get worse before they get better?
Well, the Cubans have a saying, that the good thing about it is how bad it's getting. No, I believe that we're at a turning point, really. The problem is to know to which side it will go. I believe that Chavez is responsible at least for 95% of the problems of the country, because he divided our society, corrupted the government, corrupted the armed forces, and actually created the ambiance that we are now today. I am very moved by the demonstration of the Venezuelans, how strong they were in protesting. Now there is a major challenge for the political parties in Venezuela, whether they will play their own interests or they will play the national interest above all. That's the greatest challenge that we have above all today.
All right, that is going to have to be it for the show. Thanks very much for being with us. Diego Aria, Antonio Mora, and Phil Gunson. Thanks very much for being on Inside Story. And thank you for watching. Remember, if you missed any part of this program, you can watch it again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, you can go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. We're also on Twitter. You can join the conversation there. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. You can also tweet me as well, @Hazim Sika. From me and the whole team here, bye for now.